Hi, welcome back. It's Lionel Tech Lead and partner at Westport, and welcome back to the Code Like a Pro series, where I actually go through some of the skill sets and little tips that you can do to improve your PHP coding to the level of a professional. And today we are talking about a very fundamental area. It's called naming your variables in PHP. And I know a lot of you guys are saying, because let me tell you, a small problem at the start is a large problem in the future. And that's why you want to address naming the variables. Now, when it comes to PHP, this is extremely relevant because PHP is, again, as I said in my series, such a powerful language, so flexible that you can actually do a lot of different various ways and actually still achieve the naming of the variables. Like a few points about this. One, PHP variables are very easy to create. You can create them on the fly without even naming them. Number two, they can accept all sorts of cases. That just makes it so easy. But again, with great power comes great responsibility. A little things that you can check out to know when your naming is right or wrong, and also point out where I think the risks are and where the parts that you can actually improve, and also giving you an idea of what happens in the future when you name something wrong. So let's just jump onto it.
Okay, so variables, right? Now these are the 5 biggest mistakes I see that newbie software developers, especially in PHP, making. Now the first error that people make obviously is too short, making variables that are too short. So I've seen this like one of the most famous ones I remember is for each RSI. Okay, now there is no explanation what exactly is an R. There's no explanation what an I is. Is it an object? Is it a 2D array? There's no information down there. So when you make variables that are too short, they are very difficult to understand, and when you come back you have to keep referring back to where these things originate. So you give these variables some context. There's only a couple of exceptions where you want to use them. For example, inside a function you might want to use these things. So I is usually used as an iteration, so I equals 0. That's okay because you're going to use it in a local context within, the first 10 to 20 lines. That's okay. But if we're talking about something very complicated, right, you want to be more specific and you want to give more context to your variables. So I'm going to give you a big example down here, right? You can see model name, right? You got to use name. The model is already identified on top down here, so we know that we're working inside the hub. So this must be the hub variable and name must be from there. Okay, so if you're iterating a bunch of models, then you call it models with an S. Okay, so after number 2 short, so some people actually go the other way around and they make it too long. Okay, so I've seen this happening, especially maybe from some developers from India. They're very concerned about not having information, so they want to make it very descriptive. So they say, maybe let's say the hub filtered lists by ID and name. Okay, so you get something that's really, really long, and you're gonna see this appearing many times all over the code, right? Now this has a couple of bad points. Number one, it makes your code very long. So imagine this is your code, right? And we have models and these things are stretching all over the place, right? Especially making functions that are very long. This can make your code very long. Second of all, if you have a team that doesn't speak English or that's not their primary language, it can be really confusing. So you don't want to use very long variables. They're very complicated. You want to have some context. So especially if you move them into the model or objects with namespaces, these things will actually help out to explain what the variable is. So too long is not very good idea. Okay, so don't make it too long. Something that is descriptive, that has enough information. So I always like to say, okay, if we're dealing inside the MVC, I always like to call it model, or else I'll call it model by, let's say, by filter. So filter, something like this, something that will explain it. We'll put a description in there. You don't have to be too long. You can models 2, you know, and then you know it's a instance of that model. Model 2, model filter. Okay. Number 3, inconsistent naming methods. So when it comes to PHP, there's many ways to name your variables. You can go with camel case, so you have a lowercase, so say main phone, okay, so that's camel case. Or you can have underscore case. Okay, not so common, doesn't work, is actually kebab case. This will not work in PHP. I've seen some people do it when they're naming their views. You can see over here, you can actually have it underscored, and you can also do it over here. So as you can see, right, there's a little bit of inconsistency there, and this is something that you don't want to be doing. Another thing is where the main cat case is. So one of my preferences is that if I'm dealing with ID, I always call ID both capitalized. So say client user ID is the most common, because it's a special keyword and you want it appearing all over the place. The other place is inconsistent is in different areas. So if you're looking here, right, if we're looking inside the view, you want to have inside the controller, you want these things to be consistency. ID, you want it to be small I, small d, you know. So you don't want to change them as they're going through the whole device. I've seen this, right? Hub ID, in ID. Okay, so when it comes to that, make sure you have consistency among the MVC. If you're talking about ID here, it's ID. So here I have a very good example where we have actually screwed up. On top down here, we have ID. I would have preferred to call it hub ID because it's a special keyword. Only ID is a special keyword. You'll see that appearing when you do primary keys, anything like that. And also do not get ADHD where you're changing certain variables. So 1 minute is user ID, another minute is user ID, another is user ID. Or ID or user ID. This is the worst. In my opinion, this is the worst way to do things. Okay, very, very inconsistent, and you will cause a lot of trouble throughout your application. People will be very confused about the different code and what this is and where. So one thing you want to do, stop the project, go through your team and say, okay, let's be consistent about the naming. So I like IDs that are common. If it's anything else, I like to express it with camel case. Okay, the fourth biggest problem is variables that do not have enough information. Okay, not enough info. Now, what am I talking about? This is the most common for when you are actually doing some sort of iterations or some sort of database access. So I've seen this, right? Items, model, objects. What does this mean? What kind of item, what kind of model, what kind of objects? So if let's say you're working inside MVC for hub, right? And we're starting to work outside there. Let's say we're talking about staff. Then it would be a little bit better if you did something like, instead of calling items, it's staffs. I know this is incorrect English, but we're not doing English, we're doing software development. So we won't want to use it, call it staff or staff items. One of my preference when I'm doing the arrays is staff A, so that you know it's an array of staff. Okay, so what you want to do is put enough information for people who are just reading the code to understand what exactly, especially if you're dealing with multiple different kinds of objects in an MVC, you can just name them in that kind of way. I see too many times people keep using items and objects and objects. Okay, this is going to make it very difficult for people to read your code. They're going to be very difficult, especially if it changes along the way. So PHP has the ability, right, that we can name, we don't have to set a variable in firmly, strictly. So you can actually have a model that starts with an instance of model, and the model can change into a model, or it can change into an integer. Now this is the biggest complaint that everybody always has, but if you name your variables correctly, this will not happen, and there are various methods of actually validation and strict typing it that ensures that this doesn't happen. But one of the best ways is naming your variables correctly. Okay, and then the last one is too many variables. Okay, so this usually happens when you're doing a transformation on a particular variable. Let's say you're doing a calculation and people start adding lots of stuff. So I've seen this happen. Say they say age is 25, okay, and then age 2 is 25 times 2, and then age let's say dog years equals 25 times 7 times 2 times 7. Okay, and what you're actually seeing, right, is a huge transformation of a lot of variables that make things very complicated for people to understand. What you want to do is, let's assess if we're only using a transition variable, right, that just kind of split it up. We don't actually have to call new variables all the time. If you're still working in age, I prefer if you just stick with age and the same age. The reason being is that we want to treat a variable without having lots of memory leakages, and we want to make sure that you know exactly. Remember, too many variables makes things very complicated. I'll talk more about coding philosophy and the mindset, but you don't want to have too many of these things all over the place. I've seen so many, right, where especially if someone's doing transformations, especially in transformations, right? So you want to take something and transform it. You want to transform money, or you want to transform something in there, and they're just creating variable after variable all over the place. And the worst thing is actually working it when you're passing the whole set of them. So maybe you're going from a model to a view, or you're passing it from a view into a child view. You don't want to do that. What would be much better is moving it into a function or into an object and keeping the same name. So the object would be object name, or even better, as I said, don't call it object, say staff name. Okay, and then work the transformation inside. That will make things a lot more cleaner, and you don't have all these variables sitting out there. So these are 5 of the biggest mistakes I see at new PHP coders are working on, and I see it very commonly, especially even in our level here as software developers. In a consultancy, I see these issues. You want to be aware of these issues and make sure that you keep improving it, keep relooking it. There's no harm in actually refactoring your code. I'm telling you, this is what pro level developers do. It's going to save you a lot of time, avoid a lot of confusion, make your code a lot cleaner, a lot sharper. Okay, so that's the bottom line, because the tech lead said so.